And now we'll introduce our next set of speakers. Nathan Podany monitors and carries out projects related to the physical, biological, and chemical nature of water within the Sakagan Chippewa Reservation. Most of Nathan's work is centered around the tribe's wild rice water rice lake. Carly is the North Central Wisconsin District Ecologist with the DNR.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, we're going to talk about Spur Lake today. There's a lot in this presentation, so we might not have time for questions, but there's a break after this, so we can do questions then. We can definitely do that. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, there's a beautiful picture of Spur Lake. Can you advance? Or I'm going the wrong way, I think. There we go. Spur Lake is in a state natural area in eastern Oneida County. It's about 100 acres in size. It's full of aquatic vegetation and used to be historically a very significant wild rice lake. It was important culturally to local tribal members. It's surrounded by some really nice wetlands. They're of good quality. We really don't know of any invasive species in the area. And it is a seepage lake that drains into Twin Lakes Creek, which from there goes into the Pelican River and then the Wisconsin River. Like I said, historically, Spur Lake was well known for its wild rice or Manoomin. Glyphwick has been monitoring the lake since the 60s. We don't really know where the rice came from, if it was planted or occurred naturally on the lake. There's no history of seeding that we're aware of. And it was really had a lot of really good years. But again, like Susan was saying, rice kind of follows a cyclical pattern where there are some good years and some bad. But then starting in the early 2000s, we noticed that there was a significant drop off of the rice in the lake. Starting in the 90s, the local biologists noticed that there was an increase in perennial vegetation, so lily pads and pickerel weed on the lake water shield. And since then, the rice has declined fairly precipitously. At this point, there's not much left.
All right, so although I work for the Sakagan Chippewa community, I'm not an expert on tribal history. However, for today's presentation, I can distill the migration story down to this. The Ojibwe people moved from out east based on a prophecy that said, go until you find the place where food grows on water. And that's what we call today the Great Lakes states. So Sakagan continues to have a tangible relationship with wild rice. Their trust land is completely based around Rice Lake, which is about 200 acres. And on a really good year, it can be completely covered in rice, really dense, really large grained rice. So this picture in black and white is actually the last chief, Chief Ackley, and he's standing next to a historical marker. And this basically states that there are 500 dead warriors buried in Mole Lake, both Sioux and Ojibwe. And this just speaks to how important this lake was and is. People are willing to die for it. And this picture in color is actually some community members harvesting this past year. Sakagan's connection to Spur Lake, I was shared with, was told this by some elders that the last chief would drive the community members there in his Model A. So they're too poor to all have a car, and it's a certain distance away, so they would set up a rice camp. And you can imagine when on the reservation, years are lean, the rice isn't producing, Spur Lake is everything more important. I was also told that Spur Lake would become ripe a little earlier and also have very large kernels.
So I started talking with Peter David in maybe the early 20-teens. He noticed in 2010, he went to the lake and decided that, or came back and said the water levels were probably too high to sustain rice. So he thought probably 12 to 15 inches too deep for rice on Spur at that time. And we started talking. I was involved with the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts at the time. And they partnered with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and they were looking for sites to do case studies on their adaptation menus. So understanding the potential impacts of climate change on different sites and how you might make the site more resilient or more adaptable in the face of climate change. And so they wanted us to host a workshop to run through these adaptation menus. And because there are so many people interested in what is happening at Spur Lake, we had a meeting with a number of different stakeholders, and it took place over a couple of days. And we ran through both this wetland adaptation menu, and at the time there was a draft tribal climate adaptation menu that we ran through as well. Next slide. And so this is the results of our workshop. And if you want to hit it again. These were the kind of the main takeaways with the timeline that we were going to focus on them. We ended up forming a Spur Lake working group that still exists, and we check in with the members a couple of times a year with updates on what we're working on, and get a lot of feedback from the group as well. But if you click one more time, the main thing that we decided we wanted to focus on was figuring out how to get the water levels down on the lake. So going back to what Peter David was saying, it's like water levels are too high on Spur for rice.
All right, so Carly covered some initial work and ideas, and this consisted of water depth monitoring, vegetation monitoring. Some of these pictures here were clearly working in the channel. The channel had changed. We'll talk a little bit more, but there was two structures that have kind of impounded some water, and we thought that that had led to a change within the channel. So here we see, I guess this picture in particular, those are 4 tribal youth, get their names, Hudson, Sage, Serena, and Macy. So they're flexing their muscles a bit after a hard day of work. So a lot of it was removing remnant beaver dams at the bottom of the stream channel. We did have beaver monitoring and beaver removal, but they're really busy and they don't always get all the sticks and twigs out.
Part of the adaptation workshop outcome was that we needed to establish some baseline understanding of what was happening on the lake. And this took the form of several different partnerships, one of which is the University of Minnesota, which has been partnering with Glyphwick, and they put surface and groundwater level monitors on the lake, and they have continued to do that. We've just been emailing about getting them out this year. Wisconsin DNR Lakes program had started vegetation monitoring on the lake for us. And we have a local citizen lake monitor that checks on the lake for us as well and records water levels. And then we were also able to, with a grant from Brico Foundation, hire Fish Creek Restoration to conduct a hydrologic study of the whole system. And this is just kind of an intro. Nathan's gonna.
This report is about 50 pages, so I'm going to just kind of hit some of the interesting stuff, I hope, and we can talk about it offline a bit more. So oftentimes, as you know, when you start trying to answer questions, more questions pop up. So here's a litany of the things we tried to answer and a few more questions that popped up. This is a longitudinal profile starting from Spur Lake. The red is depth of refusal, so you stick a rod down and kind of see what you're working with below the bed. This is the channel bed, and then different water surface elevations under different circumstances. So kind of a theme of the last 2 presentations is talking about water depth. And I can definitely say from my experience on the tribe's Rice Lake, right around 18 inches seems to be a really sweet spot. And you can get too low and you can get too high, and there's problems with both. But looking at rain data, definitely something we wanted to look at. This is the wild rice index that Glyphwick puts together, and the red X's around 2003 that completely fell off the map. We really haven't had any kind of rice out there, observable rice, except for a few stalks. And then the black is rainfall. So you can kind of make it what you want, but there's really nothing significant there. And then we talked to a climatologist at UW-Madison. He suggested that we're seeing increases in temperature and rainfall, but nothing statistically significant. It was kind of interesting. In about a century, there were only 2 years, this is Rhinelander rainfall data, only 2 years with 3 2+ inch precipitation events. After 1990, there were 4. I think we kind of realize, all of us, that these large rain events are becoming more of a common occurrence, and they can be really problematic to wild rice, especially in the floating leaf stage and even the emergent stage. Rice can drown, it can be ripped up really easily as well. People liken it to a bobber floating on top of the water. Usually it's growing in this organic flocculent sediment, doesn't have much of a root system. So these rainfall events and high water definitely can be a problem. And then started looking at disturbance and what annual ice cover could mean. And so this is long-term data set from Trout Lake Research Station. And we kind of just applied it to Spur Lake because they do kind of follow the same pattern. So there were comparably higher rice densities when we did have more ice, but that's not always the case. So nothing really conclusive there, but the idea being maybe kind of rip up some of those perennial plants, get a nice freeze. We know that this is a tactic done on impoundments. So just wondering what ice cover can do to rice, help rice. So this is another profile, and then this is our data loggers at the outlet. And what we kind of found was, although the outlet culverts are undersized, undoubtedly, they're not really creating this upstream ponding that is going to impact rice, except under really high, annual exceedance probabilities. So for the most part, those culverts weren't an issue, but they're still undersized, and we still want to replace them for the ecosystem as a whole and any benefit that we can gain for wild rice. And this is the full longitudinal profile. This is a private landowner's spot. The channel was manipulated, culverts are undersized, and you can see a big localized impact. The blue is current conditions, reds if you remove them. So we were thinking over time, sediment has kind of built up, and then we kind of want to scour that out and get things moving again, just return to normal. This is a bathymetric map just showing that a lot of Spur Lake is above 3 feet. So we collected this last year. The lake does seem a little deep. And it's gonna be hard to see, but these are photos starting in 1937. And what we all kind of drew from this is there seems to be more woody vegetation here. And these are just snapshots in time. I think we understand that. But as we go to the right, more current, there's more shrubs, smaller grasses and sedges compared to when we had larger trees. So this might suggest that there is more water. And then as we're deciding what to do, we just kind of leaned on, I've been in Muskegon for around 8 years. A lot of work's been done before me, but I've been involved a bit. And so we had similar issues. We replaced bridges. We removed vegetation. We did a dye study to understand flow within the system. So we tried to apply this to Spur Lake as well.
Right. So kind of summarizing, I think some of the probable causes of the rice decline on Spur are the water levels are too high and too stable. So there have been manipulations downstream on that Twin Lakes Creek, and that Fish Creek kind of suggested that along with the recovery of beaver populations in the 70s and 80s has probably very slowly increased the water levels on the lake. In addition to that, we see a lot of competition by floating leaf perennial plants, which is also exacerbated by climate change. The floating vegetation and the pond or the water lilies can change the nutrient loading in the lake through the decomposition. You can also see a lot of mats of floating vegetation that can block sunlight from getting down to the bottom of the lake. And that also with our less severe winters, they don't freeze out. So they're doing better and better. And wild rice probably just isn't able to compete. So we noticed in 2021 that the water levels had gone down a little bit on Spur Lake. And so we decided to take advantage of that opportunity to see if we couldn't do some manipulations to remove some of that perennial vegetation and seed some rice to see what the outcomes might be. So we worked with the Spur Lake working group to come up with this sample design. And we had 4 different treatments. One of them is a control, but it was different combinations of removing the perennial vegetation and seeding rice or not removing the vegetation and seeding rice. And it was a bit of an effort. We did need to get a dredging permit for the project. We had to come up with the equipment, which Mole Lake graciously supplied along with operators. And we had to hire a crane because there is no ramp on Spur Lake. So
this is kind of going to play through, and it was very tenuous when the crane was lifting the machines as the only access for some landowners, and you're up all night thinking everything that could go wrong. But here's a harvester working in those plots that Carly outlined, and very simple, just a conveyor. And he works the nose, I would call it, and just lifts the plants up and let this play a bit more. But there's going to also be what we call a swamp devil, and they're working one plot ahead because obviously you don't want the harvester in there before the aquatic plants are kind of ripped up. And so there we have it. He's going towards the next plot, and we were kind of lucky that there was a lot of this vegetation surrounding it, because it allowed these plants to kind of settle at the edge. Otherwise, the operator was going to be chasing this around the whole lake. So it kind of worked to our advantage, definitely. And this is like a 3-minute video. I'm not going to let it play all the way through, but the plots turned out quite well. Carly's going to share an aerial photo, and we're kind of really happy with the results. And one thing you might be wondering is, why did we not just bring the vegetation harvester through? You can work that nose kind of to the bottom. It's got these little teeth on it. Well, we knew from past work on the reservation that you have to get down to the sediment and really rip up and destroy those rhizomes. Otherwise, the lilies are going to grow back, essentially. So if anyone wants to see more video or pictures, we have it in abundance. But for the sake of time, we're just going to scoot forward. And this is in case the video didn't work, but Pat's got everything running smoothly here, so we're all good.
So this was the photo that Glyphwick took. So annually they survey all the lakes by plane, and you could see it. Actually, I was really surprised that the plots came out so nicely. But yeah, they look pretty good. So Nathan was able to secure some rice from us from Mole Lake once again. And in October, we went out with Scott Van Egeren and Ty Krajewski and seeded rice. And this was, I would say, a pretty fulfilling day. We put a lot of work into the project, and a lot of stuff is still unknown, of course, but this was a pretty exciting day. And if you want to show the next slide, we did have a day in August where we met with some of the people that provided funding for this project, along with some of the residents of Mole Lake came up, and we spent the day talking about rice and the importance of the site. And I think that really, it was really impactful to us to understand how important it is to local people and local beings. And then we got to take a trip to see Rice Lake as well. And so this was kind of like the after picture of the day, and it was pretty cool.
So some of what we got planned for this year, doing exclusion, fencing, more reseeding, and then vegetation monitoring, rice monitoring. Scott's graciously doing that with his crew. And then also more gauges, more data loggers for water depths, more beaver control, more of the same, hopefully more good results.
And we have not forgotten about the high water levels. So we're still working on figuring out how to improve the infrastructure on the system to make maybe a long-term impact on water levels. So if you just click 2 more times, this one on the bottom is our downstream culvert that we're going to be working on replacing within the next year. NRCS has provided funding for this local landowner to replace the culvert, and they've been really good about working with us and surveying the system to understand what would be the best thing for it, and have provided even more funding for a bottomless pipe arch culvert. So it's going to be a big upgrade for the system in that part. And then if you click again, these are the outlet culverts that are very undersized, and we need to work with a local township to try and get those replaced. And they don't have a large tax base, so we're going to have to be looking for grant funding for that probably. And then the final slide shows all of the partners in the Spur Lake Working Group and everybody that's helped work on this project. And we still don't know what's going to happen with the plots that we put in last year. We need to seed them a few more times yet. And so, yeah, it's an unfinished story. Over here.
Yeah, I'm pretty local or stay in the region, but we do get to have annual meetings with the DNR in Glyphwick, where Glyphwick does these flyovers. They do wild rice indexes and then speaking to other people. And I hate to be pessimistic, but it always seems like every year there's more bad news. And I would say we just can't nail down exactly why some of these lakes within the same county, within miles of each other, are doing so well in some cases, and then not so much in other cases. And that's why we have people like the last presenter working on stuff like this. But sometimes it is hard to be optimistic about the future of rice. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially when definitely, I mean, when you have a delta, nutrients coming in, shallow area, you'll see some small beds on larger lakes. Yep. But it drops off. You'll kind of see the depth go down. And then I've seen rice, it's too deep. You'll see it kind of trying to emerge, and it never goes past floating leaf. And it could be a nutrient issue. It's running out of nutrients. It's never going to seed out, and it's not going to, it's not going to be a viable seed. And you're not going to get a rice plant there, or it's really spindly, and you'll see smaller stalks. Just doesn't look as healthy, in my opinion.
And I'll make sure we get your email on the archive, and thank you for following up with any questions. Thank you folks for being here. We have a weekly session. Organizations. Check out. Thanks everyone for a great session.